Amir Freimann, welcome back to the Mystical Positivist.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Well, it's nice to have you with us, and we'll begin because it hasn't been that long since we last spoke on this show. You have been a busy fellow, based on the online evidence that I've been able to see. Your Living Transcendence project seems to be moving apace. And so I'm going to invite you to begin our conversation today by talking about that, what's been happening, how the project is going, and new insights that have arisen.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, maybe I should start by saying what got me into this research, and that has to do with where I find myself in my own spiritual journey, which is that I've been on the path, so to speak, since I was 16 or 17. So that's 40-something years now, and I've had some very powerful transformative experiences of unitive consciousness and around that area, which really changed my life and continue to do that. And those remain as peak experiences or mystical experiences or spiritual experiences that kind of stand out in the scenery, shall we say, of my journey. And when I read some of these sages and saints and spiritual masters or listen to them, I can tell that for them, it's not a matter of having spiritual experiences or peak experiences. They are on what Abraham Maslow called spiritual high plateau. And so I'm very interested in moving in that direction or engaging with that possibility, which to me seems a lot more significant at this point than spiritual experiences. So what is it? What makes the difference between having powerful transformative spiritual experiences and remaining on a more stabilized, ongoing spiritual high plateau? So I decided I was going to research that and meet with people who are supposed to be in that state of consciousness or existence or whatever way we want to define it. And since I don't want to limit myself to a specific tradition, I decided not to use words that are tradition specific, such as being enlightened, being awake, or union with God, or surrender to God. So I had to make up my own term for that, so that it would be more neutral. And I chose to call it Living Transcendence, which means a state of transcendence. We can talk what that would mean, but which is lived rather than experienced. And I'm very interested in how that state of living transcendence, how that works in a human body and experience and relationship and daily life and different interactions. I'm hoping that by conducting, what I'm doing is I'm conducting phenomenological research, which means I'm not so interested in the conceptualization of that state and of the insight or understanding that comes with it. I'm very interested in the actual experience, lived experience of that, of people who are said to be in that state.
So what I'm getting from you, and what I've been seeing in terms of some of the online postings that I've seen in connection with your project, is that one of the ways you're attempting to do that is to actually elicit descriptions of certain people's lives that might people who might be exemplars
Yes.
of this and it seems to me that's a good strategy to if not avoid but at least de-emphasize the conceptualization around what you're talking about. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. So, so in terms of interviewing exemplars, spiritual exemplars, I actually intended to travel around the world for the next couple of years and spend time with such people. And then the COVID-19 came in, and all that had to change. So at this point, I'm interviewing such people by Zoom, and I hope that that I would still be able, within the context of my PhD research, to go and spend time with some of them.
Yeah.
Because to me, actually experiencing them as they go around, interacting with people and doing their daily chores, that can be much more. I thought that can be much more informative than a formal interview. When all I can see is kind of the upper part of their body.
Right. Well, can I ask you a question just to frame this, and maybe this forces us a little bit into the conceptual, but living transcendence. What does that mean to you? Because you have drawn a distinction at the beginning of the conversation between peak spiritual experiences. So these explosive, transformative, I don't know if transformative is the right action. Certainly peak experience. The question is, how does that relate to living transcendence, and what does living transcendence mean? What would that, just in terms of your understanding of that expression, what would that look like?
Well, so I'll tell you that when I started reading in different traditions about what they consider the highest spiritual achievement, which is not an experience, but it's a state of being. I started reading Abraham Maslow's reports on that state, and Abraham Maslow had a nearly fatal heart attack when he was, I think, 60 something, not that old, and then he survived it and lived for another year and a half, and then had a second heart attack that killed him. And during that year and a half, he wrote his whole life about the pyramid and of the needs, and the peak was self-actualization. And then toward the end of his life, he started writing about self-transcendence. But it was only in that last year and a half of his life that he started talking about it as his own experience. And he made a distinction between peak experiences that come and go. They are part of their characterization is that they are transient.
Mm-hmm.
And that we know that from research that was done, starting with William James and then Walter Stace in the 60s. Quite a bit of research has been done on peak experiences or religious experiences, mystical, spiritual experiences. And their being transient is one of the characteristics of such experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I read in a conversation that Maslow had, that he said, my experience nowadays is that I no longer make distinction between the sacred and the daily or the profane, between basically I live in the presence of the sacred all the time, and this is my constant experience, and I can no longer, he said it has the state has the characteristics of spiritual experiences, of peak experiences, but they are not climatic.
Hmm.
So the image I had, or the metaphor I had, was he had experiences of falling in love, and now he lives in a state of being in love. So that may be a good metaphor to explain the difference between peak experiences and a state of living transcendence, or what he called spiritual high plateau. So it has, like when you fall in love, there's a state of ecstasy, infatuation, intensity with the drama that goes with it. Um, and then hopefully, when it turns into a long-term loving relationship, some of those qualities remain, but they become less dramatic, less climatic, uh, and more pervasive. Maybe we could say no. It's not. Maybe we can't say that, because when one is in love, this is that's everything that's happening for them for a while. But what I hear from Maslow, and then from the few spiritual masters that I interviewed, is that basically their daily life, their ongoing experience, is that of transcendence. Or like this woman that I interviewed, my first interviewee, she said, my life is basically very non-special. It's she used the word flatlining. And if it wasn't that, it could have been very boring, but I experienced that flatline with a sense of happiness and excitement that is like not about anything that's going to happen in the future, but about existence itself.
Hmm.
So that would be, to me, like one expression.
Right.
And then she also said, I'm like a child who is constantly amazed by very mundane things that happen. A cat walks into the house, and I'm like, this is the most wondrous event for me.
Well, you told this story of Maslow and his heart attacks, and I'm reminded of a story that we've heard from the spiritual teacher Arnaud Desjardins, now deceased, of course.
Yes.
But he too had, I don't remember whether it was a heart attack or
I think it was a coronary event of
some coronary event, and so the people around him called the medics and ambulance, and while he's in the ambulance going to the hospital, it turned out he survived this. It was not fatal this particular time, but he reported while he was in the ambulance, he reported, "Oh, this is wonderful. My practice has actually had an effect."
because he was saying yes to this.
Yeah, because he wasn't pushing it away, because there was no, it took on some of the character that you're describing of this is just life. And it was not, it was not a crisis. It was simply what it was.
Yes.
So I guess the question I would put to you is, if you look at yourself and examine your own interior process, what would be different, or what is the same with this mode of living transcendence?
Well, good question. Because you're asking me to try to kind of project my imagination on.
Well. Actually, I'm no. Let me be fair. I'm trying to be very specific, because you have decades of spiritual practice as a foundation. So within yourself, what is not living transcendence?
Um, you see, I find myself um, experiencing, or I don't know if it's an experience or the way I interpret my experience, with a certain split in myself and a certain distinction between um, times when existence itself is not only perfect but overflowing with positivity and love and perfection spontaneously, and then it's clear to me that there is nothing to do, nothing, nowhere to go, and actually any idea of having to get anywhere or do anything or change anything is erroneous, is a mistake, and a waste of time. And other times, and the other times are more like 90 something percent of my time, where I'm constantly on the move from point A to point B, and that seems to be the kind of the essence of life. That's what life is all about, is getting from where I am at now to some place which is in some way better, or better can have different expressions. And it's not just me personally, it's also kind of, I feel this motivation to change the world. So the world has to move from where it is now to someplace better. And those two seem very, I mean, my experience of them is completely different. The state of mind and the motivation for living is very different in both of them. And I want to reconcile. I want my you know, what I believe living transcendence to be is when they become one. So that somehow living in the world and being active, including moving from point A to point B, doesn't feel as distinct and separate and different from the state of overflowing perfection.
Yeah. Well, so a question that just comes up as I look at that and relate that to myself is, and this, again, this may sound a little conceptual, but it's that the two things that you described are in the realm of content, whereas the transcendence seems to be in the realm of that which is experiences content. And so, the reason I make that distinction is that for myself, I guess I'll personalize this. Just like shortly before we got online, I got an email from my music teacher, who's a Japanese teacher and filled with all of the contradictions and the many nuances of what that relationship is. And there was a way in which I hadn't been regarding him in a way that he wanted, and he was communicating that in this very indirect way, and so that created an emotional response in me. There was a reactive response. But basically, there's like a feeling that just sort of sits in my, as the fourth way people would say, my feeling center.
Okay.
But that has, that's content for me. And so if there's anything different about my experience is that rather than having to do something with that or to create some sort of abstract description that characterizes the situation, I'm just sort of letting it sit, and it's going to process and it's going to do its thing, and out of that's going to come something.
Yeah.
But that's what I would call, that's still within the body, kind of an identified experience.
Yeah.
But what's different is my relationship to that experience. It's like, is there space around that experience, or is there contraction around that experience?
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm trying to get at this, kind of dig at this somewhat, because it's for me, living transcendence isn't about the content. It is, in a way, it's about our relationship to content, and whether that relationship is expansive or whether that relationship is contractive. So the typical ordinary consciousness state of most people who don't explore in this kind of realm is to be very contracted around content. We call that identification.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing about your experience and your relationship to your experience, to me, is still. I mean, to me, it shows, it indicates a level of spiritual and psychological maturity, and obviously that kind of understanding is something that develops over time and experience. Knowing that there's quite a lot in our experience that we need to not try to do something with it, but let it do something to us. That if we try to respond, to react to it, then we're probably spoiling or interfering with the much deeper effect that it can have on us. And so it's better be left alone. That's also, I find in myself often. I had an interview with a Sufi teacher last night, and I find myself, talking a little bit about what I'm trying to do in the interview. And I said, I'm actually interested in the phenomenology of a state that is not phenomenological, which I think is what you are referring to.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll just jump in and say yes, in the sense that I guess what I was hearing, and I'm not sure this is what you were saying, but what I was hearing was that it's almost as though there's an experience that is the living transcendence. But as you say, if there's this, you're looking for the phenomenology of something that's non-phenomenological, so it can't be in the experience. So to me, it's like the content is the wrong place to look.
Wow. You're touching on a big, well, okay. So we are human beings, right?
Right.
So and the ultimate absolute reality, um, there was a rabbi called Rabbi Cook who coined the term paradoxical monism, which means that from the point of view of God, there is only one thing. But to say that for us human beings is paradoxical, because we don't have that point of view, and we can't have that point of view. So we know that that point of view exists, which is God's point of view. But how do we know that, or what does it mean for us? There is a paradox in there, because we're limited in our bodies, in our dualistic mind. I mean, everything in us was conditioned by the evolutionary process, and so there is an inherent limitation in the way I see it.
Yeah.
Well,
Good.
well, I want to go back to something you said in describing your own quest, if that's the right word, which was this apparent distinction between not moving or doing and moving and doing.
Yes.
And I guess what's coming up for me about that is is that Stewardson, my teacher, Robert Daniel Ennis, was someone who, and I lived with him 24/7 for a fair amount of time, and even after that really intense period ended, I still was around him most of the day, most of the time for quite a few years. And what comes up to me for me in regard to what you were saying in terms of this distinction is that it seemed to me from observing him and what he would be doing was that he didn't make the distinction between moving and doing and not doing and moving, but he could manifest either one and move between those two. It's paradoxical use of the word move here, but
seems looked at from the outside, it looked like he could
right,
move.
right, and sometimes he moved really fast.
Yeah.
I mean, boom, and
Yes.
he used to. We have the American phrase to turn on a dime, and
Yes.
one of the things that he stressed in my own training was the ability to move on a dime, not just physically, but also mentally, that is intellectually and emotionally in particular, because that's where we tend to get really stuck, is the emotional part, right?
Yes.
So I'm interested how that aspect comes through for you in that distinction that you were describing earlier.
Yeah. Well, there is a term, and I don't know if it's quite the same as what you're talking about, but that kind of comes to my mind. There is a term in Kabbalah, which in Hebrew is ratzov vashov, which means going there and coming back, going there and coming back. And I think that maybe that refers to the most that a human being can the highest that a human being can get is where there is constant movement between the state of emptiness or fullness or overflowing perfection and being in the world and responding to whatever is happening in the world of time and space and relationship. And that movement, as it becomes very fast and one actually moves constantly between the two worlds, informs one's responses to whatever is happening in the world of time and space and relations. Afresh, anew.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, but I'm reminded of a term that the spiritual teacher Lee Lozowick coined. I don't know if it's original with him, but it was enlightened duality. And as a someone who is trained in physics, I guess I have tended to think of, at the quantum mechanical level, there's this notion of complementarity of variables. So like, you can't determine the position of something without, definitely without losing all information about its energy, or you can't determine its energy without knowing its, and that if you know its energy exactly, then you don't know its position. And it's always seemed to me that these poles of the dual and the non-dual function in that way, that there's a, peak experiences may represent literally peaks where you're heightened, you have a heightened sort of concentration in a particular energetic mode or transcendental mode, as it were, but the normal state and the state that most manifestation unfolds in represents a blending of those factors, or a harmonious constant manifestation of those factors. And that's I think that's why I have some trouble in this idealization that somehow I'm supposed to be empty all the time because emptiness is always present. And it's like emptiness is never not there,
Yeah.
but emptiness isn't always in the foreground of the phenomenology of the conscious experience, but the intuition of emptiness, which drives the response to experience, is always present.
Or can be.
Or can be, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. In a sense of what I would call living transcendence is that, the ability to turn on a dime in the phenomenal is just that. That because when you're not transcendent, you're stuck, and so if I'm stuck on something, if I'm stuck on
An email from your teacher.
email from a teacher, or if I'm stuck on any number of sort of internal associations that may be proceeding automatically in one of my three centers, then my focus of my attention is in this very contracted place.
Yes.
But the associations of my three centers are going to proceed nonetheless. What was it that EJ Gold says in the Clear Light Prayer? With or without my presence, the play goes on.
Mm.
So I can be present to it, but in being present to it, then then I'm situated in a different relationship to the contents of my experience.
Yes. So I think to me, what you're describing, you see in different traditions, they make a distinction between very refined and rare levels of consciousness and experience and insight
Mm-hmm.
that one can reach through will and practice and study,
Mm-hmm.
and something which is beyond that, which one can get to only by grace. And you can't will it, you can't practice it. It's not a result of the accumulation of all your insights and experiences and different states. It's something else. And that is kind of put as the ultimate goal of spiritual life and practice, which is kind of paradoxical because in a way it's out of reach of our imagination, of our conceptualization, and yet something in our relation to that possibility, unimaginable possibility, I feel that I can speak for myself, that is informing, that is kind of pulling me like a magnet
Mm-hmm.
towards something which I can't see, I can't imagine, but is beyond everything that's known to me. And that's really what I'm looking for, what I'm interested or pulled toward. And you see, maybe the term living transcendence is still within the phenomenological realm. So it's something I can try to figure out. We can try to figure out, and interview each other and kind of learn and develop, which is all very valuable and very valid. But that is still within the realm of, in some way, the known, or what can be knowable.
Mm-hmm.
And what I feel pulled toward or pushed toward is something which is beyond that. And I call that living transcendence, and I don't know how to, basically, I think that the best I can do as a 62-year-old living person is continually engage with it. It doesn't
Right.
matter if it's through practice, thinking about it, reading about it, talking about it, interviewing people who are supposedly know something about that state. The main thing for me is to keep engaging with that possibility and be open to it, or
So,
yes,
so what I'm focusing on, as you were just saying, this last bit here was the apparent contrast between the effort of striving, and relaxation, and trust, or faith, perhaps a better word, relaxation and faith, and it seems to me that probably the two are complementary, and they help create each other, and then this something beyond that you're pointing to.
yes, yes. Well, it's the connection between them, between these two states, and that which is beyond. It's a mysterious connection because some people, you know, I interviewed one teacher. I interviewed actually more than one teacher who had a transformative experience when he was a child or a teenager, without any prior exposure to anything spiritual and without any maturity, really. I mean, obviously when it then happens to somebody at the age of 3 or 4 years old, you know, there is no practice or preparation to speak of.
Well,
And then,
in this lifetime, at least.
yes, yes. So, so that can happen without any practice or intention. And then some people spend their whole lifetime practicing and aiming for that which is beyond, and that never happens. Or at least in this lifetime, we should add.
Well, I guess, and that's what I'm asking. I don't have an agenda here. I'm more trying to explore this because I look at this question for myself, and you know, to what extent is the notion of this something beyond itself a kind of abstraction that has no practical content? And I don't mean to diminish the yearning or the searching for something, but if I look, you know, within myself, this distinction between the content of my experience and the just the ongoing process of experiencing are categorically quite different. And to the extent that I bring my attention to the experiencing process, I come to a sense within myself of a presence that is completely beyond the realm of the content, and intuitively, in that I touch the intuition that, were I to project it into the terms of content, would be a modes of existence that are completely different from the existence at the center of gravity of my conscious awareness resides in, which is in a human body in an apparently organized world.
Yeah. Well, I want to stay a little bit longer with that, what you called faith, Robert, and what you refer to as being not practical. Because first of all, you know, as you express yourself, Stuart, and I can relate to myself, there's not much we can do about the pull of that thing. It's kind of, it doesn't ask us what we think about it. It's kind of operating on us, in us. And I feel that no matter what I think about it, and it's not going to let go of me.
Right.
So I have to deal with it, no matter, even if I spend 50 years with a teacher who tells me, ignore it. It has nothing to do. It's unreal, and has nothing to do with your life. I don't think I'd be able. I may be able to let go of it. It won't let go of me. So I have to deal with it.
Well, let me just relate that to. I mean, there's a term I like. Rob doesn't like it in the fourth way tradition called magnetic center, and for me that has a kind of, again, this is probably my physics background for why I like this metaphor, but the what I like about that sense is that, when you think about a magnet, there's kind of this orientation, a pole. And so that in me has been a driving factor my entire life. There's always been this kind of orientation. That's what attracted me when I was a kid to reading books about UFOs, to playing with a Ouija board and contacting spirits, to ultimately finding a spiritual teacher and a tradition to work within. And that still is there. It's why we're having this conversation.
Yes.
And so I see that as a feature of my nature, in however it's manifesting itself. And I recognize that my actions in my life have added to that, in some sense, intensified that or clarified that sort of magnetic orientation. And so I don't dispute the reality of that. And I'm not disputing the reality of that. It seems to function as an organizing principle in the phenomenological.
That's interesting.
So in a way, it's not unlike the again, to think about magnetic fields. You don't see the magnetic field, but you see its effect. And so I see the effect of this orientation or this magnetic center in the organizing principle of my life. And so it definitely has an effect on the phenomenology of my life, but it doesn't seem to be embedded in that phenomenology.
Yes. Well, there's a lot in what you just said. So we agree that magnet is not something we can objectify. It's not part of the world of object that we can relate to. It's a pull from beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's where the term faith comes in. It's like trusting, believing, relating to something which we can't see or touch. Okay. So the act of faith is like our connection, our relation with it.
Yeah, and faith, and we need to be very clear about the word faith, because that's distinguished from belief. So someone listening might equate the two, but faith is more like the vector.
Yeah.
It points in the
Yeah.
direction.
Okay.
Faith basically says there's a point to all of this, whereas belief is more of a projection onto experience with a conceptual framework to try to capture it or characterize it.
Okay. Okay. And then, yes. And then you said something which to me is as mysterious, which has to do with that magnetic pull functioning as an organizing principle in the phenomenological world, which is even more kind of, I don't know. I mean, I feel the same. To me, it's completely. I don't know how to. I mean, I know different traditions, different philosophical schools try to explain the mechanics of how that works, but I don't know. I don't know how that works.
Well, let me bring in highlight another aspect of this, and I'll go back to this. Stuart quoted a line from a prayer. He said, "With or without my presence, the play goes on." And it's something. It's a prayer that I actually have repeated thousands and thousands of times in my life, at least once a day, usually. And I've almost always taken the word play to refer to the metaphor of a presentation observed by others. But there's another meaning to the word play. And another way to approach that would be through my admittedly limited understanding of the Sanskrit word lila, or divine play.
Yeah.
So, so this magnetic principle, or this magnetic, the effect of magnetism, of the phenomenon of, in the phenomenological, of magnetism from something beyond the phenomenological, it seems to me is an aspect of that, or could be viewed as an aspect of the divine play. And that's why we can't pin it down. It's bigger than our minds. It's bigger than our experience. It pulls in things that we can't control, and yet it also implies what children do. And that's a really important thing, it seems to me, is that this is not only about some pie in the sky by and by, but it's actually about how we actually live our lives as mammals, you know, running around and doing the things that mammals do with each other.
My mind just stopped for a minute.
Perfect. It's working.
As Stuart would say, you could make a monkey sound, chee, chee. Anyway, this
Well, no, I want to one more thing that that is part of the mystery and the wonder of it is that as Stuart said, you know, it seems like it doesn't have anything to do with the practical life. Practical, not only on the kind of functional survival level, but also on all levels. It has nothing to do with the reality of living in a body, with, you know, in relation in the material world, time, space, and all that. And therefore, what is it good for, or why should we relate to it? What's the point of
well,
of
it's
relating
good.
to it?
It's good for nothing, right?
It's good for nothing, right?
But I
Yeah,
mean,
yes.
there's a classic distinction. I'm sure you've heard this, of the horizontal and the vertical,
Yeah.
and so the extended world, the world of form and the world of the body, and all our concepts about that, is the horizontal realm. But the realm we're talking about is the vertical realm. And from a quote unquote practical point of view, an ordinary human point of view, yeah, there's no practicality to it. But at the same time, there's no practicality to exquisite nuance in a piece of music. You know, there's no practicality to beautifully executed art. You know, these sublime realms of appreciation and apperception are the character of the vertical realm. And so for many people, their focus is locked firmly in the horizontal with an occasional sort of tap on the shoulder from the vertical. But when we have this kind of magnetic principle functioning in us, there's a yearning towards going deep in the vertical. That's certainly, that explanation makes sense for my experience in my life. Why would I be attracted to spiritual practice? From the very youngest age, before I even had a notion of practice in any sort of sense. I was going to that realm as a strange little child, and so the question, of living transcendence is an interesting one because we are in bodies in both realms, and we can cultivate a depth. We can cultivate ourselves in an experiential dimension in the vertical, or maybe more properly, we can open ourselves as a channel such that the vertical can flow into our lives and sort of permeate out into the horizontal realm. And I think that's what you mean by living transcendence.
Yeah, it's definitely in the direction. And I want to point out that when you said it's good for nothing, there was a rush of delight. I felt that, and so there is something to say about the utter impracticality of the vertical movement that actually is delightful and makes it is part of its attractivity. It's saying, I actually don't care about what's happening in the world, in the practical world of time and space. There's something from that point of view. Our constant preoccupation, understandably so, with what's happening on the horizontal level, it doesn't care about it, and some part in us doesn't care about it, and that part lightens up when we hear it's good for nothing.
That's sweet.
And then the interesting thing to me is, can I act in the world with the understanding that as it were, that the world doesn't matter?
Yes.
Can I both have it matter and not matter simultaneously?
Wonderful. That to me is pure gold, what you just said. And to me that's also where the term transcendence, where it points to, is living in the world of action, of moving from point A to point B, of having a body and conditioning, psychological, everything. And at the same time, being non-separate from the vertical dimension and its expression and manifestation in some mysterious way through oneself.
Well, and that's where I guess I come back to the question: is it that mysterious? Is it that? I mean, maybe it's kind of like the glasses on your face. You look around for the glasses all over the place, and you discover, oh, you're wearing them. I mean,
well, you said it yourself. You said that the magnetic organizing principle is something that you can see its effect on how things get, or get organized according to the magnetic field.
Right. And
but that's all you can only see it on the phenomenological level. You don't see that which is the organizing principle itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking of there's a term that Gurdjieff used that your being attracts your life. And so you can experiment with this in the sense that if you are conscious of your interior processes and can, you know, hold, sufficient space, that choice arises and choose to be in a particular way, then you can explore to what extent that nature of the being that you choose to be attracts a quality of experience in the phenomenological.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, why would you do that? I go back to what Rob was saying. That's more about play. That's more about artistry, such that your life and the manifestation of your life is more like a work of art than having some mission of having to change something.
Yes.
Well, allow me to point out, though, Stuart, that your predication of this possibility of choice is something that is not generally available
No, no,
very readily to most people.
How,
And
can you explain? I didn't get that.
so in other words,
I was making it sound easy.
yes, Stuart was making it sound easy that there could be this choice to experiment in the way that he was describing. And
Mhm.
I'm suggesting that while that's not impossible by any means for any particular individual, people as they are conditioned by their experience in a body find many obstacles to that. And so and so that's one of the reasons that in my view that a self-examination practice is so crucial, but not indispensable, I guess, because you yourself, Amir, mentioned some of the rare persons who at a very young age find themselves able, Ramana Maharshi being maybe the most famous example
Yes. Mhm.
of this sort of thing. But even for him, it wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant necessarily going through his transition, if you will. So anyway, the choice that I simply wanted to make the point that the choice that Stuart's describing is not a simple thing.
No,
It's not something that is readily attained. Not impossible, but not readily attained.
Right. Right. Which to me connects to the question of intention and will in service of how do we intend, or how do we let that intention, it's not how do we intend, how do we let that intention that is already operating on some level in us kind of inform our life, our practice, um, and have more effect on us than it already has. Um, so that, because, yeah.
Well, I think most people would consider that they have to exercise more will to do it. And one of the things I was saying earlier is, in addition to the exercise of will, there's also the exercise of relaxation.
or the exercise
Or,
of won't.
well, that's another thing. But so
But it's
maybe
real.
this is the moment to transition to a discussion of spiritual surrender.
Yeah,
Yes.
actually, that's I was going to add to this notion of relaxation because it's something that for us is a factors into the three centers of our organism in the sense that there's physical relaxation whereas I may have had a cramp And if I can relax and let that go, energy can flow again. But at the intellectual level or the level of thought, relaxation takes the form of acceptance. Rather than fighting, if I just accept what is, that's a kind of a relaxation. And at the emotional level, it takes the form of surrender.
Well, let's talk about a few terms, and terms which are related to experiences that kind of circle around surrender, and try to make some distinctions between acceptance, relaxation, submission, devotion, and surrender. Maybe these are kind of they're around the same. They're all playing in the same field, but they have different roles or different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. So please lead us forward.
Okay. I'll try. Well, so to me, there is a passionate element to surrender, which distinguishes it from acceptance and relaxation.
Right.
So in that sense, it's a delicate thing, but I experience, when I think of surrender and the classical posture, of touching my forehead to the ground, there is an element of love and gratitude, and something comes out of me toward that to which I surrender without even knowing, it's not an object. I don't know if it's me or it or everything, but I'm not passively accepting reality or accepting God's grace. I am moving toward it in my surrender. And that's, I can tell you, when I realized it, I remember seeing it. I don't remember the situation, but I remember thinking like 30 years ago, I love God, and I feel love for people who love God. And there is something to me very special and very moving and very touching in the expression, in human body, in human form, in human emotion, of love for God and wanting to surrender to God. I'm using now a theistic kind of dualistic expression, but I think.
But it is appropriate because that gesture is relational, and so you have to have something to relate to.
Yeah.
But yeah, and to be clear about the terminology I was using, I'm not equating acceptance with surrender, and I'm not equating relaxation with surrender. What I'm saying, from as good fourth way practitioners, we look at the human organism as having three functioning centers: a mental center, an emotional or feeling center, and a physical or moving center. And the manifestation of release manifests differently in those. So in the mental center, that gesture you're talking about presents as acceptance. In the emotional center, it presents as surrender. And in the physical and moving center, it presents as relaxation. And you can see the contrary to that, because if I am tense, I'm holding on to something. If I am not accepting something, I'm pushing things away. And if I'm not surrendering, I'm fighting.
Yes. So I think, to me, another distinction I'd like to make between acceptance and surrender has to do with the impulse that one can find in oneself to surrender. So acceptance is a passive posture.
So I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I don't.
Well,
But I just want to. Well, when I'm using the term acceptance,
Yeah.
I don't. It to me, it's not a passive state. So
Okay.
I'm asserting that now because I want to be clear that we're not just confusing words that sound like each other.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I'd like, let me describe what I feel the impulse to surrender is, and see if that kind of correlates
Okay.
or matches your experience when you use the word acceptance. So this is something that I realized as I read, I wrote a paper about surrender in general, and surrender to another person more specifically, and surrender to a spiritual master in particular as a specific case of that. And what struck me as I read different different manifestations and expressions of surrender in different fields, the spiritual, in love, in sex, in the relation between therapist and patient, and leader and followers, etc., is that just as there is a desire, uh, uh, um, it's a profound, deep spiritual desire in each of us, I believe, to be free, which means to be who we are authentically, um, be a free agent in this world, and have a freedom of choice, and give our unique gifts as an individual, and bring that to fruition and express that in the world. So there is also another motivation or impulse in us, which seems to go in the opposite direction, which is to let go of that individuality and our uniqueness and a certain burden of existing as an individual in the world, and actually wanting to drop all that and be in the service of, and under the command, I don't know the expression, of something greater than us, of a greater power. And basically letting go of all of our personal agendas, fears and desires and longings, and just be in service of something else that takes over and guides us without us having any say in what we want and where to go.
let me jump in for just a
Yes.
second because I I totally resonate with what you're saying. As long as that to which we are surrendering is understood to be greater or bigger or more expansive than us, as opposed to surrendering to, I don't know, a political ideology or
Or a cult leader.
or a cult leader or I mean, it can be very mundane sorts of things as well. So I'm understanding what you're saying about this, and I think you express it
Right.
beautifully. Is surrender to something greater than oneself.
Yes. Okay. Let's explore this together, because I think that because the longing to surrender has not been legitimized in our secular modern world, and
Sure.
has not been explored and looked at very deeply, um, we get more of the pathology of surrendering to a limited and distorted ideology or leader, which to me is distortion of the original authentic impulse to surrender.
Okay.
And I think as long as we don't make the distinctions such as the one you just made, we will continue to make those mistakes. And out of the impulse to surrender to something bigger and greater than our small self, we would take it in different directions that are not necessarily wholesome. So let's talk about the distinction between authentic, wholesome surrender to that which is greater than ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and diverting it or distorting it and making it surrender to another expression of ego or another small self. That really leads to a lot of bad things in our world. So I try to do that. I try to do that by making a distinction between surrender. These are just words, but let's see if that surrender on the one hand and submission and obedience on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And submission and obedience are like cheap imitations. I mean, they can look very, sparkly and powerful, but
Yeah.
they're still, in a way, cheap imitations of the surrender posture, or
Yeah,
the impulse to surrender.
I was
Yes.
thinking that the distinction that you made about active and passive plays here for me, where submission to me seems like it is a more of a passive act. It has the valence of giving up, whereas surrender seems to be more of a conscious affirming and a active. That surrender always has to be activated, whereas submission you sort of you can kind of forget about.
Let me throw in a slightly different perspective because I'm thinking of, for example, the poetry of my favorite author Ursula Le Guin, and she often talks about surrender in terms of surrendering to the Tao. That is to say, to this both personal and impersonal flow that we experience within ourselves and outside of ourselves. And when we're doing that, we can feel light, and when we're submitting in the way that you're describing, and I like this distinction. I think it's a useful one. We won't feel light. Submission doesn't feel light. Either we're experiencing the power of something else or someone else, or we're imagining that we are powerful because we have submitted to something else or someone else. And that's not light.
Mm.
That's not easy.
So I think it was a researcher by the name of Tybalt who explored the 12 steps of the AA, the Alcoholic Anonymous movement or
Mm-hmm.
methodology, who said that in surrender, all of you on all levels, conscious and unconscious, kind of move in the same direction, while in submission, externally, consciously, you express positive attitude, but subconsciously, inwardly,
Mm-hmm.
there is a negativity
Hmm.
and resistance to the movement, to the external movement. So that's how he distinguished between authentic surrender and submission, which correlates with how you just express it. I find that on a theoretical level, it's a useful and important distinction. On the experiential level, I don't know how it works. I don't know if we can make that distinction so easily. I mean,
Well,
considering also that we human beings have a profound tendency to uh, mislead. What's the word? Mislead, not mislead.
mislead ourselves.
Yeah. I,
Ourselves. Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I'm thinking of the notion that Miranda Kaplan has of conscious discipleship,
Yeah.
and there does, like working with a spiritual teacher, there's a way to engage with the teacher that has a valence of surrender in the sense that we're describing, and there's ways in which people submit to a teacher too, and sometimes it can be the same teacher, and some people are submitting and some people are surrendering. But the surrender is it's a conscious act that one is engaging in, but one is still fully responsible. Whereas with submission, when one engages in submission, one is claiming or affecting that they aren't responsible.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, again, we can make that kind of distinction, which is useful and real in retrospect. But
Yeah.
well, I can just let's just look at two experiences. So my experience of what, especially in my initial period with Andrew Cohen, which I consider to have been in a position of surrender. There was passionate, loving, ecstatic surrender, and a lot of doubt, constantly struggling with doubting him, doubting myself, doubting what was happening, and resisting it and not accepting it. So that's like, on the one hand, an expression. I would think of it as a state of surrender that is not only positive but also a lot, struggling with that positive movement.
Mhm.
And then, as the opposite example, I watched a documentary about the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 30s, and they interviewed these two women who were in a youth movement at the time, and they told about their experience when Hitler came to visit their town, and they worked for days and nights preparing, the main street for the parade of his arrival. And what an ecstatic, joyful, I mean, they were in tears and their eyes were sparkling as they were describing that incredible experience they had of surrendering to something which now we say was like a horrible, bad event. I think they had less doubt at the time when they were giving their whole to preparing for Hitler's arrival. They struggled with less doubt than I did in my surrender to what was happening for me in the presence of Andrew.
In fact,
So,
they had no doubt, right?
well, maybe I don't know. That was like a long time ago. So time changes to kind of
But that
But
in a way,
of what happened.
well, I mean, the thing here is, and it works in terms of spiritual teachers too. Well, there's an attraction to this pairing of submission and surrender, which is to align yourself with something powerful, and that can be a high. That can be
yeah.
absolutely, it can be a high, and you don't even have to know how to make the distinction between submission and surrender at that moment, it seems to me. So for these women, they were high in a kind of way, not because they thought, oh, thank God Hitler's going to enact this ideology or something like that. They were, they were serving something that they considered to be greater than their own egoic needs and creating conditions and aligning themselves. And it was a high, you
Yes,
know.
no doubt.
And same for you when you were no doubt as it was for me. I mean, I had this one moment where I decided, well, I mean, in retrospect, and I really appreciate that you brought this up. It's easy to make these distinctions in our experience in retrospect, but I don't know. In the first year that I met my teacher, I decided I was going to. What I now realize, I decided I was going to try to submit myself fully to the work, to the spiritual practice, and I made this gesture of moving my body to a certain place, and I realized in retrospect, oh, that was just me trying to submit, and um, and at first it felt powerful, and then when nothing happened, it was a big deflation. So, but that wasn't surrender, I can say in retrospect.
Well, it's interesting as you say that. It makes me think submission has a manipulative quality to it. When we submit, we're actually trying to control things.
Yeah, I think it's really important to try to see, to experientially make the distinction between the experience of surrender and submission,
Yeah.
so that people can make that distinction in real time as they are experiencing it, and avoid bad situations.
Well, bravo if your Living Transcendence project
Yeah.
enables even one person to be able to do that better. That's really,
Yes.
that's a wonderful ambition.
There's a notion that comes up in the fourth way of conscious suffering. And one form of that that Gurdjieff speaks about is the willingness to endure the displeasing manifestations of another being towards oneself. And when I think about the qualities of conscious suffering, there's an intention, there's resistance, there's kind of the standing firm in the resistance. Occasionally, there's a sort of a transcendental spark when energy is transformed in the process. And I wonder, to some extent, I look at the words you used to describe your relationship with Andrew was one that was had elements of conscious suffering because it was not easy,
Yeah.
but there was an intention that was being played out, and you stayed in the presence. And that's why when I use the term, like Mariana's term of conscious, discipleship, there's an intentional quality to surrender, and it requires an ongoing reaffirmation because it's not necessarily an easy process.
Right. Right. Well, I think we agree that it would be incredibly valuable if we can make the distinction between surrender and submission on the phenomenological, experiential level. That it could save a lot of people a lot of pain and heartbreak,
I,
and a lot of bad things in the world. I mean, you see it. You look at the effect that Hitler and Stalin had on the world, and you see how much could be avoided if people could make that distinction in themselves.
I agree, and because we're not at the end of our conversation, but we've been going for a while, and you brought up the word devotion, and I would love to hear what you have to say about devotion, especially in relation to the conversation that we've just had about surrender and submission.
I actually, it's a word that I didn't explore as much as the surrender and submission and obedience. I started thinking about it more since last night when I interviewed this teacher, and she used that term, and I started wondering about, what it meant. So it seems to me that it is related to surrender in the sense that it has a quality of love and of would you say that there is a certain element of admiration? And I don't admiration is not is yes
the word that's coming up for me is praise.
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 That's a
To
good one.
praise that which is greater than oneself. To praise, I mean, we praise one another when we see someone acting selflessly or generously
Mm.
or in some way that goes beyond our usual egoic expectations as projected onto others.
Well, can we say that devotion is more of an internal, subjective, emotional state, and surrender wants to be expressed in action in the world, and in how you? Because that's a connotation for me. I realize that there's something very attractive about the concept of surrender to me because it wants to be expressed. It doesn't only want me to experience surrender. I want to live out
Yeah.
a surrendered life. So there's something about wanting to be used. I mean, I know this sounds like masochism, but wanting to be
No,
No, not to
no,
us.
not if God's using you.
Yeah, but
That's ecstasy.
but I mean, I can be devoted to a teacher, but not surrendered to a teacher.
okay,
If I'm surrendered to the teacher, then I'm going to do what the teacher says,
okay,
and
okay.
and that will often be move me against modes of resistance in myself. So devotion may support me in my intention to surrender. I don't know that I would say it's necessary, but it is certainly helpful. And I agree with you that surrender is performative or it's an action, it's an
Mhm.
expression, whereas devotion is a an emotion or an energy, a movement of my attention.
I'm not sure I agree with the two of you on this one.
Okay.
The trouble is
Well,
I don't have a better
I
way,
mean, it's
a
I
better
mean, the language is
expression.
relative anyway. I mean, I think that whether you like the use of the word, there is a
No, no, it's not the word. It's what it evokes in me.
uh,
Uh,
So I had this, at least moderately intense Roman Catholic background as a child. I think in our previous conversation with you, Amir, I mentioned this very early powerful experience in a church at age like 3 or 4,
yes.
and then I was incredibly as my childhood went on, I was incredibly disappointed over the years in what was evoked in me later in that context. But I think it's probably that early experience that leads me to seek not just an internal feeling, but I think something like this quality of active giving of myself to something greater in the way that you were describing surrender. I'm not sure I'm as happy with separating it as much as Stuart was just describing
separating.
surrender and devotion.
Huh.
Um, because emotional, sure, that would be. I don't think you could separate devotion from emotion. That is, have devotion without emotion. But I don't think it's only an emotional manifestation. And I'm just flying off the cuff here. I actually, I don't know. The reason I asked you is because I want to know more. I want to know more about what devotion is because I read poetic, beautiful things expressing devotion or claiming to express devotion. And yet I still have the yearning to experience devotion unmediated by a particular experience, I guess.
Rob, do you think that that one's devotion can be tested in the same way that surrender can be tested?
I think that's a fabulous question that I have never considered. I don't know the answer to that question, but I really am grateful to you for asking it because, well, I guess now that what's coming up for me is that my teacher was incredibly important to me and powerful, and I fought like hell against all the powerful and useful things experiences he gave me to help me let go of a lot of the emotional, intellectual, and even physical cramps that I had in my body. And I came to see at times that he was still a human being and had flaws. And so maybe I'm answering my own yearning here a little bit because I'm realizing that in retrospect over the years, at those moments when I contemplate moments of pain for me, when I felt not seen by him, both on a ordinary human level, but also perhaps on a transcendent level. Moments when I thought he, dropped something, as it were. That the devotion is, in some ways, about forgiving him for being human, as I forgive myself for being human, or try to. And when all the dust settles, I remain devoted to him because of what I received from him. And maybe the devotion can hold all the incredible utility and good along with those when the ball got dropped. So that's just me off the cuff.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
But that is the devotion being tested.
Yeah, no, that's why it came up, I think, because you asked that question. I think that's I really have to meditate on this more.
Yeah, me too.
But that's why a good question is better than 10,000 great answers.
Well, can you maybe a different way of looking at it, can you surrender without being devoted?
I don't know. Maybe they are tied in a certain kind of way.
Well, it depends. I think then we have to make a distinction between different contexts because, for example, people use the term surrender also in surrendering to reality, or to an artistic impulse, a creative impulse. or to one's authentic self. So I wouldn't use the term devotion in relation to reality or to the artistic creative impulse or to one's authentic self, but I would use the term surrender in those contexts.
Yeah.
So maybe the key word here is love. Devotion is about, or is expressed through the medium of love, or through the connection that love engenders.
Well, yeah, well, or surrender to a teacher requires a devotion or a love to be present.
Mhm. Mhm.
That may be, as you said, I mean, that helps maintain or establish the surrendering, even when the conflicts in that surrender sometimes reach high proportion.
I had a lot of conflicts.
Yeah,
Well, I think this is a very it's an important conversation and important distinctions
yeah,
that we're trying to make, and I like the fact that we're trying to make those distinctions not just theoretically so that we can improve, what's written in the dictionary,
Right.
but we're trying to look into our own experience and be able to describe it from within,
Yeah.
which is a lot more valuable than changing the definition of the word in the
yeah.
dictionary.
So we're working on your project as we speak here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and in that sense, I want to say, I want to use the opportunity and say that I feel this is not, in some important ways, this is not my project. I'm playing a role in this movement of exploration and interest and deepening, and it's not really mine. I feel moved by, whatever is moving me in this research doesn't belong to Amir Freimann. I mean, Amir Freimann belongs to it. And in that sense, I feel, that when I experience the two of you, I feel that you are motivated by the same kind of recognition, or maybe we could use even the word surrender to something which is greater than ourselves.
Sure, I'll sign up to that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think of Lee Lozowick's formulation of learning to be a slave of God.
Yes.
That the ultimate surrender is to the all that is, and that's what our practice ultimately is about.
Well, I have two lines that I love from a poem by a Jewish Spanish poet, philosopher, and physician. I think 11th, 12th century, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and it's, the slaves of time are slaves of slaves. The slave of God alone is free. So to me, this is a beautiful distinction between being a slave of time and being a slave of God. You are a slave, whatever, no matter what, you are serving something. So the question is not, do I want to be a slave or not? The question is, am I serving everything that's created in time and by time? Or am I a slave of the infinite, ineffable, vertical dimension?
I don't know if he'll appreciate it as much as I am at the moment, but we have a friend in the Tibetan tradition who loves the word mysticism and understands what he's been up to in his life and other people whose work he respects as being mystics. But I think a slave of God is certainly one one nice way to express or define the mystic.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sweet.
Hmm.
It's ironic because I've just, here in America we're having this political moment when the status of people who are descended from slaves is being examined in a way that people have cried out for the last 150 years, and now to a much deeper extent than has been true in the past, that's actually starting to happen among people, some of whom have slave-owning ancestors or had slave-owning ancestors.
Well, what do you feel that has obviously that has a social and political and economical connotations or dimensions? Does it have a spiritual dimension, that kind of looking into slavery from a spiritual perspective?
There's a spiritual perspective I see to the extent that, one character of spiritual work is to peel back the illusions that we're identified with. And this process is one of peeling back many layers of very comfortable narratives that certain parts of society has fed itself, and in feeding itself has allowed itself to lose connection with the lived experience of other members of society.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think that it is spiritual to the extent that someone is willing to look within themselves and to challenge the narratives that one has consumed quite unconsciously in being raised in a particular socioeconomic sector in the society. And it's not spiritual to the extent that people are in reaction to that process, one way or the other, and that reactivity is, you'll find on either side of the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I don't know the answer to the question I asked, but I think it has something to do with Martin Buber's I thou and I it
Yes,
relationship.
yes,
Because to enslave somebody basically means that you relate to him or her as it, as an object at your service.
Yeah.
And there is no way of having an I thou relationship with a slave, with somebody that you relate to as your slave.
right. And that carries over to the fractioning of the civic conversation in this country, where there are the other side, whether they're liberals or conservatives or white supremacists or activists. There's a very strong tendency right now to objectify the other,
Mm.
and to the extent, and that is enslaving someone. Ultimately, is to objectify, because you cease to be a person and you become an object. And it can be that objectification can take place at a mental level, and it can take place at a lived out physical level, but it's an objectification nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, to the extent that we can move past that, I I have high hopes for the possibility. We're interviewing someone on Sunday who does a lot of work on nonviolence, and that's the core. That intuition is the core of the work of nonviolence. It's learning to relate to the other as thou, and not it.
The other thing, because we're running out of time here, but I want to make sure to add this to this skein of the this thread of the conversation is that to be a slave of God is a choice. In fact, it's a choice that has to be constantly recreated moment by moment, and that's not what's happening in the discussion of human slavery and chattel that we've just been pointing to, and so that's really important. God doesn't make slaves of us in the way that humans make slaves of one another. And Stuart was just pointing to a subtle way in which we enslave each other by objectifying one another. So, I mean, that's a subtler form than cracking the whip, but nevertheless, it is also a work of violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, is a common form of violence.
Yeah. So what you are really saying is that if we really care for each other and specifically for each other's spiritual being or soul, then we don't want to force anything on them. We want that choice to come from the deepest place that we can recognize in ourselves, and which is the same deepest place in them.
Yeah, well put. And that's
a great place to conclude this
appropriate last
lovely
word.
conversation.
So thank you, Amir, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
It's been a lot of fun, and we look forward to our next conversation because there are topics we didn't get to this time.
I'm sure that we'll find some. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.